Okay, continuing this week's lecture, I want to now turn my attention to the continent of Africa. I'm not going to cover everything in the textbook, but I'm going to focus primarily on um, conditions in Western Africa. And I want to kind of pull out, kind of fill in some of the background of the area, and hopefully kind of expand your understanding. If you're anything like me, this is a part of the world you don't have as much knowledge about, and so this is probably good for both of us. All right, Dr. Roth refers to this as Afrolineal crime, which is he defines as organized crime originating from Africa or Caribbean nations. I'd like to point out to you something I found kind of when it comes to Africa in general. Dr. Roth points out four things that he found especially that made Africa vulnerable to organized crime, these being income inequality, rapid urbanization, limited unemployment of young men, and then the poorly financed CJ systems. Of course, you can read about those things in the textbook. I want to focus today on Western Africa. And for those of you kind of unfamiliar with Africa, here is kind of fun holding up maps to the camera. This is the region of Africa that we're talking about, and so you might find somewhere, take a screenshot and print it out or something. Find your way to get you a copy of this. So as I talk about different countries, you'll know what we're talking about. You can see this is a region with a large number of nations. There are several of them here. Many of them you might recognize. Countries like Nigeria that are in the news an awful lot. In this area. But you understand this is the area we'll talk about. Countries that we'll speak about that you'll hear the name of several times during this lecture will be nations like Senegal, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Côte d'Ivoire, Côte d'Ivoire. I actually had a student that if I pronounced this, someone who spoke French pronounces this the country of the French sounding name. Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, and Mali are countries that we talk about quite a bit. All of these many nations, all of these nations, with the exception of Liberia, were at some point or another colonies of a European power. And Liberia, of course, being the exception, because Liberia was the country set up as an independent nation by the United States after the Civil War for any of the freed slaves who wanted to go back to Africa. But the rest of these nations, other than Liberia, the rest of the nations in Western Africa, again, they were colonies of major European powers. All of them gained their independence from those European powers in the last half of the 20th century, beginning with Ghana in 1957 and then continuing with the rest of them. Also, the other thing that all these nations have in common is that, for the most part, during their first decade of independence, they saw some fierce national pride, saw a great boom in their economies, a lot of growth, a lot of promise. Things started out well, except as things went on, you start to realize some political instability in these nations, particularly in Ghana and Nigeria and Mali, Sierra Leone, Togo, Benin, among others. Towards the end of their first decade, you start to see a lot of political instability. You see them go from being democratic states to one-party, almost totalitarian regimes. And so you start to see violence creep in. In the 1970s, I know, you think today, oh, it was $4 a gallon for gas, that's horrible, and I agree with you, it's terrible. 1970s is kind of our first oil crisis, and we were shocked, to have to start paying 75 cents a gallon for gas. It was horrible. Gas prices were out of control. If we only knew then what we know now. But the oil price increases in the 70s caused, for every country in that region except for Nigeria, who was actually an oil-producing nation, caused a lot of economic difficulties. And even in Nigeria over time, you start to see economic difficulties anyway. Largely because you see a lot of immigrants from the other neighboring countries go, hey, things are pretty good in Nigeria, let's move there. And so you see increases in crime and unemployment as a result. Eventually, every one of these nations, Nigeria probably being the last of them, turned to the World Bank, turned to the International Monetary Fund for assistance. Like there always is when it comes to borrowing, lending money, there were strings attached. The World Bank said, okay, we'll help bail you out, much like what's happening with Greece today and the European Union. But they say, we'll help you out, we'll lend you money, but you've got to go into this period of structural adjustment. We need you to let us come into your country, tell you how we want you to change things, because someday we want our money back. And we certainly don't want to see our investment go to waste. And when they looked at these countries, they said, we want you to focus on what culturally is a major money-making export for you. And despite the fact that most of these countries were gearing up, were working towards industrialization, one of the strings attached to the IMF and the World Bank money was they had to turn their focus around back to agriculture. And so you saw a rapid dismantling of all the progress they made towards industrialization. At the same time, there was a rapid devaluation of their currency, such to the point where you hear descriptions of Germany after the Treaty of Versailles in 1917, where the German ruble or the German mark was worth next to nothing. These Western African nations, their currency becomes worthless paper. They were required to cut back on state employment, and so they had to cut back on the number of their own citizens that they hired to work in government, which causes increases in unemployment and other problems that come associated with that, like crime. And they had to decrease their spending, even in areas like welfare and education and healthcare. And so you see increases in unemployment, increase in unemployment. At the same time, you see social services being cut. You see all the progress made towards industrialization reversed. And this is a recipe for disaster. Add to that, one of the many unforeseen consequences was that, for a long time, you see a lot of these Western Africans, they would go to Europe and to the United States to go to school, gain education, then come back, and then go back to Western Africa to apply what they've learned. And unfortunately, you end up seeing, after this structural adjustment in a lot of these nations, the best and the brightest people in the Western African nations, instead of going home when they finished their education, they just stayed where they were. They realized that the place where they were coming from was all that great. They were grateful to get out of there, and so they would get their education and just stay. They wouldn't come back. And so, on top of all the economic problems, you see a lot of their intellectually promising young people leaving the country. By the 1990s, you start to see great increases in violence and conflict, beginning in 1989 with the Civil War in Liberia, then in 91 the Civil War in Sierra Leone, followed by similar conflicts in Senegal, Mali, Guinea, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire. This spells everywhere else in the world. This has always spelled opportunity for organized crime. And so now we shift into talking about organized crime in Western Africa, now that I've kind of built you a historical background. Most people, particularly most law enforcement folks in Africa, point to the 1970s and the economic difficulties that started there as the origin of organized crime in Western Africa, though some say, it had existed before then. In addition to economic problems, they point towards increases in shifting population after the 1975 creation of the Economic Community of Western African States, or ECOWAS, ECOWAS, which created opportunities for networking between individuals and criminal groups. Though there were attempts to regulate immigration after that, those attempts made things worse. And then combined with the warfare and the violence in the region, organized groups of criminals found opportunity, first in dealing weapons and arms, and later in dealing drugs. In Nigeria, organized crime roots apparently have occurred much earlier than other places in Western Africa. The organized crime groups in Nigeria started out much more sophisticated than other Western African nations. You see involved in falsifying trade imports, and this involved a lot of sophistication in the corruption of public officials. It certainly required the cooperation of government officials, as the way it worked was these crime groups, they would over-invoice imports, and so you might import 50 metric tons of a particular good. Your invoice would say 100 metric tons. You might import substandard goods for delivery to government services, and so you might get the government to overpay for shady goods, and you certainly would need a corrupt official to go along with that. And then what would end up happening is the government official would then do some kickbacks to the criminals. In the 1980s, you see a more likely genesis for Nigerian organized crime. You see an origin for increases in organized crime because in '86, even Nigeria went into this period of structural adjustment, and the other nations had experienced, and so you see a great increase in poverty and unemployment. You also see a rapid liberalization of the financial sector along with poorly regulated banks. And so you see Nigeria become an interesting haven for people that want to get involved in money laundering and fraud. And then the first recorded cases of heroin smuggling in the region started in the 80s in Nigeria. Regardless of which country, the growth of organized crime in Western Africa can be traced back to four causes. And they're similar, and the four causes I have through the sources I use are fairly similar to things Mitch Roth points out in his book. These four things are first and foremost the poverty in the region. Second would be an increase in drug addiction, which accompanied an increase in drug trafficking, and a little bit more about that later. Third would be the frequency of military coup and the spread of warfare, which always creates opportunity for organized crime. And then corruption within the government and the criminal justice system, most notably the bribery of judges. One particular story I read talked about a 2004 arrest of cocaine smugglers. The police caught these individuals with 675 kilograms of cocaine, about a $140 million street value of coke. And for this $140 million street value of coke, the smugglers were released on $200,000 bail, which the judge probably pocketed. The drugs disappeared, and so did the smugglers. It's no surprise that the Corruption Index lists Nigeria as the second most corrupt country in the world. When we talk about, we're talking about the growth of organized crime in Western Africa, but can we really measure the extent of organized crime there? And I would say the answer really is no. It's very difficult to estimate how much power, how much money, how many organized crime or criminals there are in West Africa, largely because researchers give very little cooperation in Western African countries, and the West African police tend not to keep records. And so there's a lot of data to work with. What do we know? Well, we do know that the Western African region plays a significant role in worldwide drug trafficking, but very few substances are actually produced in Nigeria and other parts of Western Africa, but rather Western Africa becomes much like Central Africa, much like Honduras and Panama and Nicaragua, in that it is a trafficking route of these countries. Conditions in Western African countries make Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire and Liberia and Sierra Leone, make them wonderful transfer points. And so you see cocaine and heroin, other drugs coming out of South America and Southern Asia, come into Western Africa, and then head into Europe and the United States from there. But drugs are not the only form of crime coming out of Western Africa. I'll talk about a little later Nigerian fraud schemes. When we talk about extent, we're trying to put an extent on organized crime in Africa, or even transnational crime in Africa. I would say that, understand that 58% of fraudulent insurance claims in the United States are made by Nigerians. Nigerian fraud in the United States results in an estimated $20 to $26 billion a year in losses in the U.S. And this is one of these times you have to ask yourself, is what's going on with transnational crime in Africa really organized? Because, when we talk about defining organized crime, the organization is one of our key elements. And for the most part in Western Africa, there really is no hierarchy, corporate-like structure to point to and say, hey, this is the organizational structure in what used in place in Western African nations. What we see most commonly is almost a master-apprentice type relationship, that you would see in some trades like electricians and plumbers or blacksmiths that are in the Middle Ages, where you have a single individual who becomes extremely successful in a particular activity. And when his business grows to the point where he can no longer handle the business himself, he will hire generally junior family members, so younger people in the family. He will bring them into the organization in a permanent part, make them his apprentices. And so you have the old master who knows how to do the business, passing on his knowledge to his apprentices. And this forms maybe a core group of 3 to 5 members. Hold on.